Welcome to the Diabetes Bio Podcast, a podcast for the Diabetes Journal, the flagship research publication of the American Diabetes Association. Each month, we interview authors from our feature articles, papers of the month, or other articles published in that month's print issue of the Diabetes Journal. We also have a Sweet Talk segment where we get a little more creative in our scientist and topic interviews, and we have a fun one for y'all today. My name is Darlene Sandval, and I'm joined by my podcast co-hosts, Dr. Kirk Habiger and Dr. Kevin Williams. Happy Monday. How are y'all doing today?
Hey, Dar. How's it going? Kevin?
Hey, Kirk, Darlene. How's it going?
I have a busy week coming up, 2 back-to-back trips, but the second trip is a birthday trip to Page, Arizona, so it should be good.
Nice.
Where's Page? Tell me. I'm not familiar.
It's right on the border between Arizona and Utah. So that's where Horseshoe Bend and Antelope Canyon are.
Okay.
So yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. So we're doing a group trip down there, going to do a little hiking and maybe a little running.
Nice. Well, that'll be
You
good.
driving out there? Are you flying?
No, flying. Because I actually am coming from Boston. So I'm flying from Boston to Vegas, and then we're driving from Vegas to, it would be a long drive. I think it would be, because it's kind of in a weird area of the state. It's not like great highway access or anything. So I think it would be 12 to 16 hours or something like that. It's a good drive.
See, Kevin, in places where it's not completely flat, sometimes you have to go around obstacles.
That's right. I've heard these places exist somewhere.
Yeah. Myths and legends.
That's right.
How's fall going for you two? I assume the leaves are nice in Alabama. Yeah? No?
Oh, it's still green. We're completely, it would be a Midwestern summer right now.
Oh, that's
so,
right. I guess you don't really get, do you really get fall? Do you get the fall color?
One day.
About 2 or 3 days. Yeah.
Where
like everything.
And then it just falls off the tree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Same
fall
in
is
Dallas?
literally the leaves falling off the tree.
Yeah.
That's it. Yep. This is state fair season.
Oh, are you going to go get yourself a twice fried Twinkie or something?
Yeah, everything deep fried.
Yeah.
It goes on for like 3 weeks, a little over 3 weeks. They get 2.5 million people going to that thing.
Wow.
So it's
wow.
Have you ever gone?
Yeah, we typically go every year. We haven't gone this year yet. We might go this week. We'll see. We try and find the discount days and hit the fair on those days.
And what do you do at the fair?
You eat. You go around and you eat a bunch of food. You can go watch livestock, auctions and shows that way. They'll have pig races. They have dog races.
Well, I know what
shows.
usually happens at a fair. I just want to know what Kevin and his wife do at the fair.
Oh, no. We go get corn dogs, turkey legs, try and figure out what the specialty food of the year, what was selected as best tasting and I guess best visual presentation and taste those. So, yeah.
Cool.
It can be a fun time.
Yeah.
And it's also cross country season, right? So
yeah.
Those things go well together. You eat a lot and then
exactly.
you get rid of it.
You got to fuel, right?
That's right. You have to fuel.
Fuel is so important for recovery and and performance.
Get your turkey leg protein.
Wherever you can get it.
All right. Well, let's talk some science. We're doing one featured paper interview today, and then we have a very special Sweet Talk segment. So, Kirk, why don't you tell us about the article which we're discussing?
Yeah, we had a great article, and not just because I study glucagon, but we talked to Dr. Tessa Cacciottolo and her work on glucagon receptor deficiency and how they were able to find a causal factor for early onset hepatic steatosis. I thought this was a really cool paper. It almost was like doing a mouse study, but these were people, right? So they had this very rare genetic variant, right, that caused a deficiency of glucagon receptor signaling. They tied it to hepatic steatosis, and in one patient, they required transplant, and that reversed it, which is exactly kind of what we see when we do our mechanistic mouse study. So it was cool to see that translate so well.
I agree. I thought it was really cool. It definitely, like, the pathophysiology was matching up to the mouse model, right?
Absolutely.
It's pretty cool.
Absolutely.
All right. And how about our Sweet Talk segment, Kevin?
Yeah, today we're focused on childhood obesity and diabetes. September was Childhood Obesity Month, but these conditions not only affect kids' health, but they also shape their futures. We'll be talking about the complications children can face, and importantly, the stigma and weight bias that often come with these diagnoses. To help us explore these issues, we're joined by two leading experts in pediatric health, Dr. Kristen Nadeau from the University of Colorado Anschutz, and Dr. Bethany Cartwright from UT Southwestern Medical Center. We'll also be doing something I think that's really special with this episode, that in addition to this expert discussion, we'll feature questions directly from kids themselves. We think their voices will make this conversation even more powerful. So please stick around for this very special episode.
All right, let's dive in.
Today, we have a great segment for this episode. We're going to be discussing glucagon receptor deficiency causes early onset hepatic steatosis, which is published in the October print issue of Diabetes. It's a great topic, and we have all three co-hosts here today. Hey, Kevin. Hey, Dar.
Good morning.
Hello, hello.
We are also joined by first author, Dr. Tessa Cacciottolo. Dr. Cacciottolo is a Chain Florey Transition to Independence Fellow in the MRC laboratory of the Medical Science at Imperial College London. Tessa, congratulations on your paper, and thank you for being a part of this month's podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Did you notice Kirk's enthusiasm about talking about glucagon on an early Monday morning?
You know, we all have our strengths and weaknesses, Dar.
Tessa, thank you so much for being here. We like to start with an icebreaker question. So this is a little bit of a surprise. We didn't provide this to you beforehand, but I thought I would ask a question we haven't asked in a while, and that is, what is a favorite place that you've lived and why?
So I've lived in two places. I've lived in Malta and I've lived in Cambridge in the UK. So I might go with Malta because it's probably the least known of those two. So Malta is a small island in the Mediterranean, just at the southern edge of Europe. And I grew up there. I did my undergraduate training there. But it's because of where it is, it's a melting pot of, European culture, a bit of North African culture, with better weather than the UK, probably better cuisine. And it's a great place for us to go on holiday, these days. So that was a great place to live.
Awesome.
Tessa, before we discuss your article, we like to give our authors the opportunity to highlight any other contributing authors or collaborators that really advanced this work.
Yeah, so I think this was a really collaborative effort from a combination of clinicians and scientists who really worked hand in hand on this project. And so I think all the 19 authors in various core facilities who helped bring this forward are really worthy of highlighting, but also, great thanks from me for bringing this forward.
Can you start by giving us an overview of your research program and how this project grew out of that?
This work took place in the lab of Professor Sadaf Faruqi at the Institute of Metabolic Science in Cambridge. And her lab focuses on the mechanisms driving human obesity, taking an extreme phenotype, rare genotype approach to do this. And I'd done my PhD in Professor Faruqi's lab, working in obesity. But I should also say that I'm a hepatologist by training, so I'm a liver doctor. And as I was finishing my PhD now towards the end of 2019, steatotic liver disease, or fatty liver disease as it was called then, was becoming a major problem in our clinics and our liver wards. And I became increasingly interested in the mechanisms driving hepatic steatosis. And I began thinking seriously about taking a similar sort of extreme phenotype, rare genetics approach to study steatosis. And with this background then, just after the pandemic, Professor Baker from King's College in London, this is a major pediatric hepatology center in the UK, contacted us about his patient. He had a lean boy with unexplained steatosis after having done all the investigations they could think of, asking us one, if we were interested, and secondly, if we were able to understand what was going on. So, of course, the answer was yes, and that's how this specific project began.
Nice. Building on that, I'm curious if you could take us down the road a little bit of the history of glucagon. It really seems like for years, glucagon was thought of mostly as a rival to insulin, kind of the bad guy in diabetes. And your work is suggesting it's also protecting the liver. And I know you went a little bit into the background of what led you to this study, but maybe you could talk more about this and why it was important to pursue.
Yes, so I have to say that when we set out, we didn't quite set out to study the glucagon receptor specifically. We were presented with an intriguing clinical phenotype, and we wanted to get to the bottom of it. So we had two individuals from the same consanguineous family who were not obese, and yet they had steatosis. So we hypothesized then that the phenotype we observed was due to a rare, highly penetrant recessive mutation, but didn't quite know what gene that would be in. And for that, we took the approach of sequencing the family. So the two family members who we knew were affected and the boy's parents. And importantly, I think the analysis strategy we took was to look for rare variants, which were homozygous in the affected individuals. And so is that what led us to the glucagon receptor? So I think what makes this really important is that we can see such a clear phenotype in humans, which segregates with the genotype. And the fact that it is not overcome by other compensatory mechanisms, I think indicates that it's a critical mechanistic pathway for the regulation of hepatic lipid metabolism. And so, as you alluded to, I think it could make it a really good therapeutic target for the treatment of steatosis. And conversely, the antagonists, which were previously progressing at pace for the treatment of diabetes, could be quite deleterious from a liver perspective.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the clinical presentation of these individuals? You talked about, of course, the hepatic steatosis, but what are other notable findings?
Yes, so first of all, the presentation itself for both of the cases we present here were quite non-specific. So the boy presented with abdominal pain, and I think the collective view is that this was likely unrelated to the glucagon receptor, but that triggered some investigations which showed a raised alanine transaminase, and then that was investigated further. And same for the second case we describe here, who first presented just because of needing some blood tests for a pre-employment check. And that's where the raised ALT was picked up. And of course, the third homozygous case we describe, who initially we thought was going to be a healthy control, but actually again found a raised ALT and found that she had significant steatosis. So I think that in the early part of the condition, this is definitely a silent or non-symptomatic presentation.
Yeah, I was just the age difference in which these were discovered. So it sounds like you think the abdominal pain was just sort of in the boy was just sort of unrelated, and that's how the liver disease was found? Or do you think there's something different about the way that these people are responding to the mutation?
I think it's hard to know for sure, but I think the description of the abdominal pain, which was generalized, is something we see in other children as well, on and off. I think it's hard to know with a single individual whether this is definitely due to the mutation, but it's not a symptom which is typical of steatotic liver disease. So, yeah, I think it's hard to know for sure whether the abdominal pain was directly caused by the mutation or not. And we have discussed it, among the various clinicians who've been involved with this, and we think it's unlikely. But I think that's one to keep watching, if we discovered other variant carriers.
Yeah.
Okay, Tessa. Now I want to move to something that really struck me when I read your article, and that was that one of the patients after transplant had complete resolution of their symptoms. And so I'm hoping maybe you can provide a little insight into not only that case, but maybe what it tells us about glucagon receptor signaling in the liver.
Yes. So first of all, I think there are different symptoms he had. There were symptoms associated with liver failure and portal hypertension, so ascites, edema, encephalopathy, all of which resolved. And that's something we commonly see after a liver transplant. But more specifically, and I think what relates directly to the glucagon receptor mutations, is this normalization of the amino acid concentrations, the fall in the glucagon concentrations, the reduction in the size of the pancreatic nodule, and even the size of the pancreas itself. So I think this really highlights the liver-pancreas axis, where the glucagon receptor deficiency causes the raised amino acid concentration, stimulates your alpha cell hyperplasia, hyperglucagonemia, and pancreatomegaly. And all of these features, very remarkably, are reversed with transplantation. So I think this implies that the axis is totally dependent on hepatic GCGR in humans.
Yeah, I think that that's fair. I also think it's a beautiful accidental knockout rescue study, right? Just like we would do in the basic labs. So it's really cool to see that sort of replicate over.
Absolutely. And it's not a common opportunity to be able to do this in people.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think building on what Kirk just said, you not only studied these metabolic changes in the human subjects, you actually recreated a double GCGR mutation in stem cell derived hepatocytes. I was curious if you could tell us more about how you did this and what it revealed about the fat metabolism in the liver.
Yes, so we had the family studies and we had strong genetic data supporting, the claim that the double mutant led to steatosis, but we wanted to test it more directly. And one of the problems when studying hepatocyte metabolism is that immortalized cell lines, which are very commonly used for this research, have very different profiles to primary hepatocytes. And so we wanted a model which more closely resembled human hepatocytes and one which we could manipulate genetically. So this is where the iPSC-derived hepatocytes can be really useful tools. And firstly, we used CRISPR and homology-directed repair to introduce the human GCGR mutations into the iPSCs. And we did this in tandem, so one at a time. And it's really important to make sure that we weren't causing any other genetic abnormalities. And then using the wild-type cells and the mutant cells, both of which had been through the same rounds of CRISPR, were used to measure net lipid accumulation. And interestingly, I decided to do this under different concentrations of fatty acid supplementation in the medium. But what we found was that the double mutant had increased or significantly increased lipid accumulation under basal conditions. So that is conditions in which we didn't supplement the medium with additional lipid. And now so further mechanistic work is ongoing, but that's the finding we'll report in the paper.
It's really great. I love the pairing of the clinical observations with the in vitro models that you presented. That was really great.
Looking at the big picture, what does this story teach us about the risk of targeting just one hormone at a time? Do you think it even provides more fodder for using combination therapies for treatment of metabolic disease?
That's a really interesting question. I think it is important and relevant to understand what each is doing in its own right, then understanding how putting different agonists together or different combinations together could give you more or less. And I think it increases, the versatility of what you can do or what you can target. I think certainly for the case of the glucagon receptor, I think it definitely highlights the risk of chronic antagonism from a lipid perspective, lipid accumulation perspective, but also the real risk of progressive liver disease in that context. And so I certainly would be concerned about further development of these antagonists, which I think is the position the field more generally has taken. But certainly, I think the agonists, there's been a big explosion of GCGR agonists coming into clinical trials, both for MASL, but also metabolic disease more generally. I think it's an exciting time. Of course, so far, the agonists have been used in combination with other incretin receptor agonists. And there are pros and cons to that. So I think understanding the individual and the combination still has a role, because I think it can allow us to be more selective or more specific, perhaps, in how we target them and how we use them clinically.
Well said. Tessa, before we wrap up, are there any key points you think we've missed, something you'd like to leave our audience with, or maybe give us an idea about what you're going to do next?
So lots of questions there. I think we sort of touched on the therapeutic implications of this work. So I won't repeat that, but it is, of course, important. Where I take this work next, so I am continuing to work on these variants and on the glucagon receptor, particularly from a intermediary metabolism and liver perspective. So that's something I'm very excited about. Perhaps the other broad point, which I would very much like to highlight here, is the importance for us as clinicians to keep an open mind when we see patients. I think we all have a handful of patients who don't quite fit, the typical phenotype, or don't follow the dogma, but they could be really critical in providing insights into underlying physiology or disease mechanisms. And I think that's in such complex situations. I think it's really important for us to work collaboratively, often across departments, just as we did here, to solve these clinical conundrums. And I think that benefits individual patients. Certainly, the family here were quite keen to know what the reason for their clinical presentation was. But also, we might be able to benefit the wider population and the wider community. So I think that would be my closing remark, to just look for these patients who don't quite fit.
Very cool. Well, Tessa, we want to thank you for joining us today. It's been a great discussion on glucagon, which is always a good topic if you ask me. I just want to remind our listeners that this article will be featured in the October edition of Diabetes. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Welcome to another edition of Sweet Talk. I'm Kevin Williams, and I'm joined by our co-host, Dr. Darlene Sandoval and Dr. Kirk Habegger. Today, we're focusing on childhood obesity and diabetes. These are conditions that affect kids around the world and come with both medical complications and stigma. We're joined by two leaders in the field, Dr. Kristen Nadeau from the University of Colorado Anschutz and Dr. Bethany Cartwright from UT Southwestern Medical Center, to walk us through this very important topic. Welcome, Dr. Nadeau and Dr. Cartwright, and thank you both for joining us today.
Hi, thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you so much.
So we like to start these things off with a little bit of an icebreaker question. And so I have a question for both of you. We'll start off with Dr. Nadeau. If you could solve one unanswered question in your field of research today, what would that be?
Thanks for the question. One thing that I have really been struggling with trying to understand is the fact that type 2 diabetes in kids seems to be more common in girls versus boys. And we think one of the reasons is just because puberty starts earlier in girls. So artificially, they are a little bit further along in the growth and puberty process than boys at a particular age. But another part really seems to be because physical activity levels tend to drop off when puberty starts in girls and not in boys. And some of that may be our society and messages that girls get, but there are some interesting studies looking at populations that are remote and not interacting with social media and light and things like that. And even in those populations, it seems like when puberty starts in girls, physical activity declines. And so there may be some reasons that happens that might help with being able to get pregnant, but it also could be detrimental to a girl. And so I just wish we could understand that better to really know how best to help girls to try to help stop this from happening when it's not really necessary and prevent diabetes in them.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I'm sure it's an area of the field that many are not aware of. And so that's a really interesting question. Dr. Cartwright, what scientific question or mystery keeps you up at night?
Well, I have 3 kids, which includes twin toddlers, so they're what literally keeps me up at night. But what I worry about on a daily basis for my patients is that we really have, as a field, we really don't have any idea as to when we have done enough for a patient with obesity. We can't expect most patients to get to a completely normal BMI with most weight loss interventions. We also know that normalizing the BMI isn't necessarily required in order to make significant health improvements. But because we're dealing so much in future risk, in what's going to happen 10, 20 more years down the line, it's hard to know when we've really done enough to improve some of those long-term cardiovascular outcomes. So if I have a teenage patient who works very hard on healthy nutrition and physical activity, well, that can be definitely enough to lose a few pounds, maybe turn around something like prediabetes. But can I then celebrate and switch our focus to maintaining those behaviors? Or is this a patient where I need to do more in order to protect them from having worsening health in their 20s, their 30s, their 40s, even if they continue strong efforts? So the truth is, we really don't have any idea. We don't have any treatment targets other than the current state of weight or disease in order to guide that thinking about future risk and in order to know how much weight loss or how much intensity of weight loss interventions is enough. And I think that's especially tricky in pediatrics because we as pediatricians, we definitely have a culture of wanting to use the minimum interventions necessary because any intervention has added risk and burden for a growing and developing child. So finding that right balance between knowing when we're doing enough for the patient while also avoiding anything unnecessary is something we're not very well equipped at all for right now in the field, I think.
Yeah, it's great. It really is an evolving landscape of trying to understand the risks that are associated with these diseases and those treatments. It's great that you two are actively involved in this. And I have another question for both of you as it relates to obesity and diabetes, and whether or not, as the field, should they be considering obesity and diabetes in kids differently than we do with obesity and diabetes in adults? How does it relate to potentially comorbidities as they develop and risks as they become adults? We could start off with Kristen and then we can go to Bethany.
So when obesity is occurring in kids, kids don't live in isolation, they live in a family. And kids also have a developing brain where they are at different stages and may have a very complex relationship with food because the media tells them to eat certain things. There's advertising and packaging that's aimed at kids. There's foods are colorful and have things that kids like. There's a lot of input coming into kids that's telling them to eat something. And at the same time, they're being told, try not to eat some of these things. And it's really confusing and complex, and especially when kids may not be even able to understand the long-term consequences of weight and diabetes. And also families then are the people who are around you and are also influencing what happens with kids. And it's difficult when a family may be doing something in the home, but then when a kid leaves and goes to school or in other environments, there are a lot of other influences. And so we just have to really think about the fact that each kid is at a different place developmentally and where's the best place to be meeting them at, and that's going to change each time you see them as well, to know what's the best way to approach them and their family.
Very nice. And Bethany?
I agree. The psychosocial and developmental side of things is so important whenever you're talking to a child with obesity. And it's also extremely important at those sensitive ages that any weight conversation has to be especially careful and compassionate and sensitive. Because you're talking to someone who's still forming their own perceptions about weight and self-esteem and what that means for them and how they fit in the world. And you really need to avoid piling on more stigma and shame during those sensitive time periods. The stage is very different for children in terms of psychosocial development. There's also probably an extent to which there are biological developmental factors as well. We know that many of the weight-related health complications that are associated with obesity are often more severe in childhood onset obesity than in adult onset obesity. And we still don't know a lot yet, but there are some clues that there might be, in addition to some of the psychosocial foundations for that, there might be some biological foundations for that as well. And we really don't know a lot about the developmental biology of childhood obesity at some of those really young ages. Most of the work that's been done so far has been on the biology. It tends to be in teenagers, where the biology is a bit more similar, especially after puberty, to what's going on in adults. There's not nearly as many studies that's been done in those younger ages. So we really don't know all the ways in which obesity, which starts in the younger ages of childhood, might affect outcomes in ways we don't realize yet. And so both basic science and clinical research, I think, need to do a better job of addressing those younger age groups so that we have that information.
Bethany, let's continue to talk about something you touched on in your article for this month's print edition of Diabetes, and that is about kind of the health and function of adipose tissue in kids. Can you talk a little bit about maybe what the differences are between kids and adults in this aspect, or what the health and function of adipose tissue in kids, what this means for understanding childhood obesity?
Yeah, this is a really interesting area, and this is, my chosen field of research is the developmental biology of adipose tissue in growing children. And it's an area we unfortunately don't know a lot about yet. We know that adipose tissue is a big determinant of metabolic health and obesity, and that it's not just about how much adipose tissue you have. And in fact, it's not even necessarily really predominantly about body size at all, so much as it is about the healthy functioning of that adipose tissue. So once you get into the range for obesity, how severe your BMI is as an individual doesn't do a good job of predicting whether or not you're going to get type 2 diabetes or other metabolic syndrome diseases. Factors that are more predictive are the distribution of that adipose tissue. So whether someone has subcutaneous versus visceral adipose distribution. And then there are even cellular factors that we can see that correlate well with adipose tissue dysfunction and insulin resistance and diabetes risk. Those can be things like adipose cell hypertrophy is something that's strongly associated with insulin resistance, as well as local adipose tissue inflammation and fibrosis. And all of these factors, again, they correlate more strongly with metabolic syndrome than the actual individual BMI does. Now, we know that a lot of those relationships are the same in kids, or at least in teenagers, where most of the studies have been done. But again, it's very, very few adipose tissue studies that have really looked at those younger age groups. Those studies that have looked at younger age groups have shown that how adipose tissues expands is different in younger age groups. And adults expand adipose tissue more by adipocyte hypertrophy, which fills pre-existing adipocytes. Whereas children, they expand by adipocyte hypertrophy, but they also expand by adipocyte hyperplasia, or the differentiation of new adipocytes, much more robustly than adults do. And so we know that that's at least one big difference in the biology of adipose tissue between children and adults, but we don't know yet all of the implications of that and how that might ultimately influence different outcomes in childhood onset obesity.
Do you have any idea how that transition is? Like what age it happens? Is it a slow transition? I assume it's a slow transition.
Yeah, I assume that as well.
Yeah.
The puberty seems to be when we reach what we call an adipocyte set point. So you have robust adipocyte hyperplasia at various stages during childhood, with a big burst during puberty as you set those adult patterns of, kind of male versus female adipose tissue distribution. And then after puberty seems to be where that is pretty set in place. And then there's not much new adipocyte differentiation after that in adulthood. It's usually thought to be more of a turnover or maintenance replacement rate at that point. How that switch happens during the process of puberty, exactly when during puberty it occurs, we don't know. And we don't know what determines some of the other phases of some of the other patterns that we see in younger childhood either. Those are all very open, very interesting questions of the field.
Some of the information that we've discussed when talking about what's different between kids and adults seems depressing, but we also have information from the bariatric surgery studies when we compare kids to adults that it looks like kids respond better to bariatric surgery than adults do. And although we certainly are not hoping to have to continue doing bariatric surgery in the future, what the hope is that we can learn why it seems to be working so well in kids, and if there are ways that we can understand those mechanisms to better direct our care at kids in the future. But it is exciting that it seems that kids may be at an earlier stage in some ways of the way their body's responding, and they may actually be more amenable to intervention.
Bethany, I want to continue on and talk a little bit more about your paper. In that, you cover the role of stigma in treatment, right? So what are some of the most common ways that kids and families experience bias when they come into the clinic?
Gosh, this is a really challenging area, and it's challenging because stigma and bias and all of these little micro ways that patients experience it are just so pervasive, really everywhere in our culture, and the healthcare environment is no exception. I think one of the most common things that patients tend to experience is a blaming or a scolding approach from a healthcare provider who may be well-meaning and may want to impress the importance of disease risk, or who may want to scare a family into making a change. But what we have in the data is that these sorts of stigmatizing or shaming encounters really, in addition to just harming the patient relationship, they also harm the patient in terms of leading to worse outcomes in both weight gain and in metabolic disease. So I would be at a loss to describe all of the different ways a patient might experience weight stigma, because it's just so pervasive and so common. And it's something that I think each of us as providers needs to be very, very careful about how we approach patients to make sure that we are counteracting that as much as we can, and to be a safe space for our patients.
Yeah, that's a great point. And are there maybe phrases that we should stop using, or conversely approaches that we can hone in on, right, that will get us to a more stigma-free approach?
I work on this a lot with the residents at my institution, the pediatrics residents. And one of the things that I teach them is to never make assumptions, to always ask where the family is coming from, and to always lead with, have you had concerns about the patient's weight? Because if the family already has concerns, then there's no need to pull out a growth chart and harp on where the BMI is, or really, pile on. You can go straight into talking about individual behaviors. And by and large, for most of what I do in my clinic, I don't harp on the weight really. And I try to use the words obesity or weight as little as possible. We might talk about it a little bit to frame a conversation, but then mostly we're just talking about individual behaviors at that point. And I really emphasize with my families that my goal isn't to get anyone to any particular size. It's just to help them be the healthiest version of themselves that they can be.
All right. So this will be a question for Kristen, and then maybe for if Bethany wants to comment as well. But if there's one thing you could change tomorrow about how we approach childhood obesity and diabetes, whether science, policy, or clinic, what would it be?
One thing I would like to change is the approach to the way that drugs are studied and interventions overall in kids. People need to go through safety trials, of course, making sure that medications are safe before they're used in kids. But a lot of times there's a long period of time that occurs where drugs are being used in adults and kids are not brought in until much later. And when we look at kids with obesity, and generally the fact that because a lot of the complications associated with obesity don't really occur until after puberty, kids' bodies are actually quite mature. They're the size of adults, and there's a lot of restrictions currently that are occurring with the drug trials that are really leaving kids out unnecessarily. And so I really feel like we need to be considering them sooner. And most importantly, because it does look like kids' responses to medications are different. So if we spend a lot of time finding out information about adults and then get started in kids much later, we don't even know what might be different and what we should have been looking at sooner.
Can I actually ask a follow-up to that? And maybe both of you can comment, but the comorbidities are much more aggressive, and I think you both touched on this in the intro. And do we know anything about like what happens? You don't address those comorbidities, they're more aggressive in kids. Does it then just get completely more exacerbated over time as they reach adulthood?
Yeah, so there are a lot of differences that we're learning over time about the difference between obesity and even more so type 2 diabetes and the other comorbidities associated with obesity in kids versus adults. We learned from the Today study initially that some of the interventions, including medications as well as lifestyle interventions that had been more effective in adults when used in kids, were not as effective. And then when we studied kids in the RISE study directly in comparison to adults who were given the same medication treatments, we found that the kids did not respond as expected as the adults did. And in particular, we learned that kids with prediabetes did not appear to have benefit in preventing progression from prediabetes to diabetes when given the type of medication, metformin in particular, that had been used previously in the diabetes prevention program in adults that did help with progression. And when we studied them head to head, we learned that kids have a much higher degree of insulin resistance. We think that that's happening because of the insulin resistance of puberty. But as a result, likely to overcome that insulin resistance, the pancreas has to work quite a bit harder. And in fact, when we measured it directly in the RISE study, kids make about twice as much insulin in response to oral or IV challenges. And so one of the theories is that because the pancreas has to work so hard to overcome the insulin resistance of obesity as well as the insulin resistance of puberty, that's just such a demand on the pancreas and that may be pushing it towards failure. Another factor that's likely going on is the fact that if you're having obesity and insulin resistance occurring during puberty, it may be affecting other organs differently than what we see in adults. And one example of that is the phenotype that we see when you look at MASLD or metabolic associated liver disease. In kids, the biopsy, if you take a biopsy of the liver, the phenotype looks different than what's happening in adults. And so it may be the combination of hormones, puberty, growth hormone, things like that are occurring during this time frame may actually result in a different disease process. And we know that growth hormone is high during puberty, that causes insulin resistance, but it also may be having effect on other organs. Another example is that the kidneys are still growing and changing a lot during puberty. And what we tend to see in younger people is that the rate of filtration in the kidneys, we call it hyperfiltration, is much, much higher in an adolescent than what happens in an adult. And so having diabetes occurring at a time when the kidney is changing and having these different kinds of aspects that are unique to kids happening, they really may result in different outcomes and different ways that complications are occurring.
Thanks. That's a great summary of a lot of work. Bethany, do you want to? There were two questions there. The one was focused on one thing you could change, and the second about the comorbidities associated with childhood obesity.
If there were one thing I could change right now, I definitely agree with Dr. Nadeau's discussion of the need for a more robust pipeline for new medications. I also, if I could change one thing right now, would be the access to the medications that we already have. Because, for example, in my practice, 70% of my practice in our obesity clinic are Medicaid patients. And Texas Medicaid, like a majority of state Medicaid organizations, doesn't cover any medication for an obesity indication. for 70% of my patients, my hands are completely tied. I may see a patient who weighs 400 pounds, has impaired mobility, sleep apnea, any number of health complications. But if he does not have diabetes, then I cannot get him a medication to treat any of this, even though highly effective medications are available and FDA approved for his age range. So if I could change one thing overnight, that would be it, is really just being able to use the tools we have to treat these pretty severe disparities in patient access to effective treatments.
Yeah.
Oh, and then the question regarding health complications, I could not possibly summarize the effects on type 2 diabetes better than Dr. Nadeau did, but I will just point out that aside from diabetes, we have studies suggesting that long-term risk of cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality are higher for childhood onset obesity than for adult onset. So that's an indication that, yes, this is a different, possibly more severe disease, really across the board, whether a patient has diabetes or not.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask a question from the perspective of families who might be listening. You know, there are many parents that are dealing with their children having obesity and diabetes and feel overwhelmed, maybe by the medical information or the day-to-day management, or even, as we discussed, the stigma that their kids may encounter. And I was curious, what kind of advice would you give to those parents who are trying to support their kid, but they're also managing their own worries? We could start with Dr. Cartwright and then move to Dr. Nadeau.
The main advice I give the parents that I work with is to take things one choice at a time. And I give the same advice to the teenagers sometimes too. It can feel very overwhelming, and it can feel like someone is trying to advise that you change your entire life and turn your entire life upside down all at once. And when we think about it that way, it absolutely feels impossible. It is impossible to change everything all at once. So this is why longitudinal lifestyle therapy and longitudinal support with lifestyle therapy is so important for every single patient, because we really can only take things one step at a time. So for any family who's feeling overwhelmed at all, the absolute most important step you can take is the next step, and then the one after that, and just one step at a time.
Nice. Dr. Nadeau?
Yeah, thank you. I totally agree with Dr. Cartwright's comments. And then I think another is that making sure that families are reminded, not to be adding to the stigma. These kids are undergoing so much stigma, shame about their body size, being told they're not trying hard enough, or feeling like they're lazy because, they're not able to make changes, and are often bullied at school. And so trying to have the home environment be a place that's supportive and, not additionally layering on pressure that, that these kids are doing something wrong and that this is their fault, and trying to help get the message out that there's some people that are unlucky and we don't really understand why, that tend to gain weight more than others, and other people seem to be able to eat anything they want, and that, it's not about who has better willpower or is a stronger person. And so trying to support the kid from that standpoint. And then really, not trying to single a kid out, especially if there are multiple kids in the family, and making this something that the whole family is doing together, what's healthy for the whole family, trying to find things that are fun that the family can do together, that sneaks in exercise, rather than saying, this kid's got to get on the treadmill for 30 minutes a day. You got to find something that the kid really enjoys and feels good about. But also trying to make changes that are simple, that they don't have to have massive changes, and have a dietary degree, but that we're trying to do things that are aimed at making simple changes that are practical, and something that has a message for the whole family working together to try to be stronger, not trying to be losing weight and smaller.
It's really great. I think y'all both highlighted that, definitely the individual needs to be supported and have a support network. That support network itself also needs its own support. And so I think that's really great to highlight. Now we're going to switch and do a little something different. We thought it'd be fun and important to hear from people at the heart of this conversation. and that's the kids themselves. We asked children of different ages to send in their questions about diabetes, obesity, general health, and we'd love to have our experts respond directly to those questions. Our first questions come from our youngest contributors, kids who are just starting to think about what it means to be healthy.
Oh, hi. My name is Tyler. I'm 4 years old. I live in Austin. Why is sugar bad for you? My name is Alexandra. I'm 5 years old. What do I eat to stay healthy?
We had two questions there, one from Tyler and one from Alexandra, asking some pretty important questions for the kids as to why sugar is bad for you and how do you eat to stay healthy. So, Kristen and Bethany, how do you explain these big questions to kids that are only 4 or 5 years old?
I think an important thing to know is that what we think is the healthiest food is real food, so whole foods. And what I like to use as an example is an apple. If you squeeze the apple and take the juice out of it, it's mostly sugar. But if you eat the whole apple, you get the peeling and the inside, you get the fiber, you get the vitamins that come with it. And so all of the foods that we recommend eating, usually it's trying to eat a real whole food and not one that has extra colors and extra flavors added to it to try to make it seem more fun. And that sugar is in healthy food. So it's not necessarily that we say you shouldn't ever have sugar, but that we are trying to recommend foods that are not mostly sugar and that have all the other parts that your body needs to help balance things.
All right, next we're going to hear from kids who are asking more about how diabetes impacts the body.
My name is Allie. I'm 13 and I'm from Buda. Why do you have to pee so much when you have diabetes?
Hi, my name is Eden and I'm 6 years old. Why do you need to cut your leg off after you get diabetes?
All right, Kristen, do you want to start with those complicated questions about urinary frequency and amputations?
Sure. When you eat sugar gets inside of your blood. And if you can imagine pouring sugar into a cup of water, if you put more and more sugar into it, at first you can stir it in and it will stay as a liquid. But if you put more and more scoops in, it's going to get thicker and thicker. And that's basically what would happen if you put more and more sugar into your blood. It gets too thick and then your blood wouldn't be able to move around well. And so one of the things your body does to protect your body from that happening is it keeps track of how much sugar is in the blood. And if it senses that there's too much, it tells your kidneys to try to help take that sugar out of the blood. But the way your kidneys work, you can't pee out a chunk of sugar like a sugar cube. It wouldn't come out that way. It would probably hurt. And so instead, your kidneys take the sugar, but it takes water with it. And that helps you to get rid of the extra sugar so that it can go into the urine. But if you do that, then you don't have enough water in your body. And so that your body also tells you to drink more water. And so that combination ends up happening frequently when blood sugar is high, that you pee more and you're more thirsty.
Bethany, do you want to tackle the amputation question?
Yeah, I can try that. Well, the first thing I want to say is that most people with diabetes do not have to have an amputation and do not have to have their legs cut off. So that's something very scary that can happen to someone with diabetes, but usually does not. And I don't want any kids with diabetes out there thinking that that's definitely going to happen to them. When it does happen, the reason is because that high sugar in the blood over time can cause just little bits of damage to the blood vessels in our body, the arteries and veins, and especially the tiniest blood vessels like those in our feet, that bring blood and that bring oxygen to our toes and all of the little nooks and crannies of our body. And so over time, and I mean over a long period of time, like decades, If the blood sugar stays high for a long period of time, that can cause enough little bits of damage to those blood vessels that then maybe the toes or the feet don't get as much blood as they should, and then they can take damage. And sometimes, again, not very often, but sometimes that can be dangerous enough that someone needs to have an amputation. I want to emphasize, like I said, it's not most people with diabetes. Most people with diabetes are able, it takes hard work, but they're able to keep their blood sugars in good enough to control to prevent that long-term damage from happening. So if that's something that any young person with diabetes is ever worried about for themselves, the best thing that they can do is to listen to their doctors, listen to their parents, and making sure that they're taking their medication and doing what they need to do to take care of themselves every day.
Great.
So now let's shift gears a little bit and go from talking about complications to talking about people who excel in spite of this disease, right? And you're going to hear from two young athletes who are fascinated by sports, and also how do people with diabetes compete, right? So let's go to those.
I wonder whose kids they are.
I have no idea. All right, Dash, how old are you?
I am 11.
11. Where are you from?
Birmingham, Alabama.
Cool. Do you have a question?
How do F1 drivers with diabetes drive a car?
Hi, I'm Baden and I'm 16. How do athletes with diabetic deal with it while being an athlete?
Yeah. So Dr. Cartwright, maybe we start with you.
I can answer Dash's question specifically about the Formula One drivers because I Googled it when I saw the question, and there are not currently any Formula One drivers with diabetes, but Google tells me that there are a few Formula 3 drivers with diabetes. So maybe if those drivers keep it up and have a lot of success, they'll get there eventually. I will say that in generally, athletes with diabetes, those that I know, they succeed the most really by getting a lot of support from their team in terms of they work hard at keeping their diabetes in control using technology, and a lot of the really intense athletes work very closely with nutritionists to make sure that they are optimizing things as much as they possibly can for their performance. So a lot of them, the really professional ones, they really have a big team that's supporting them. They're not doing it all on their own, which is a big part of it. I'll also say Dr. Nadeau may have more specifics than I do, but I will recommend for any young person with diabetes who's interested in athletics. I am not a sports person, but I know that there's a wonderful podcast out there called Diabetics Doing Things, where the host is himself a former athlete with diabetes, and he does a lot of interviewing of people with diabetes with a lot of different jobs and backgrounds, including a lot of athletes, and they will have lived it, so they will know much better than me all of the little tips and tricks.
Dr. Nadeau.
Yes, so I learned a lot by your question, so I really appreciate it by reading about race car driving and diabetes. And a couple of the things that I learned, one of these I did know already, which is that before you start driving a car, if you have diabetes, it's good to make sure that you're not starting with a low blood sugar. So one thing the race car drivers will do is check their blood sugar before they start. And some of them may tend to let their blood sugar run just a little bit higher while they're actively in the race, just to try to help prevent a lower blood sugar. But then they'll make adjustments afterwards to make sure that overall they're not running high. But there's some really neat technologies out there now that help these drivers using combinations of continuous glucose monitoring with an output on the dash where they can see their blood sugar. And one driver I learned has a helmet with a double straw system where he'll take a sip of either sugar from it if it looks like the blood sugar is decreasing, or water if it looks like his blood sugar is going up, to help manage in the middle of the race what's happening with the blood sugars. And there are also people who use insulin pumps in a way that they can adjust their settings to be ideal for what happens during the race, whether they tend to have blood sugars that go up or down. So these technologies have really helped people to be as active and be really successful in their careers.
And any advice for athletes who are maybe more on the physical strain demanding side, I guess, as opposed to, a race car driver is it's definitely demanding, but it's more mental maybe than actual muscles contracting, right?
Yes. So I think an important thing to do when you're in the middle of an exercise event, and especially if it's a really long event, like if you're someone who's a triathlete or running a marathon, something longer, is to make sure that you have the ability to check your blood sugar during the event, be having food sources with you so that you can take in calories as you're needing it as you're going through the race, and also working with your team to make sure that you can have different patterns if you're using an insulin pump that are programmed. And sometimes this is trial and error, where people need to do the event and see kind of what happens, look at their continuous glucose monitor, and then make adjustments to their patterns so that they can have it set up to best have the length and type of intensity of exercise that they're choosing to do.
Great suggestions. Thanks.
Celine wants to know something about what many kids wonder about when they see the shots or the insulin pumps.
My name is Selene. I am 9 years old and I live in Dallas. Are taking insulin shots the only way to help diabetes, or are people finding different ways?
It matters a lot what kind of diabetes someone has as to whether or not they need to take insulin. In our current treatments that we use today, if someone has type 1 diabetes where their pancreas can't make enough insulin, or if they have type 2 diabetes, but their insulin production is low enough that they can't make insulin, these types of people often will need to take insulin, because the only way that we know how to replace insulin that's completely missing is to give more insulin. In other situations, there are kinds of diabetes like type 2 diabetes where the insulin may be made, but it is not working as well as it should. And we call that insulin resistance. And in that situation, sometimes by making changes to diet or exercise or using medicines that helps your own body's insulin work better, then you can treat the diabetes with other types of shots or with pills. But it varies a lot by the type of diabetes and sort of where in the diabetes process someone is at. But the goal of what people who are studying diabetes is currently is to try to figure out ways to make the easiest approaches. And sometimes in type 1 diabetes, we're trying medication to help insulin work better on top of the insulin to try to see if we can reduce the need for insulin.
Nice. And our final question is on the opposite continuum of obesity and weight gain. It's about how kids feel pressure with their weight, especially in sports. And we have Noah that has an important question here.
Hey, my name's Noah. I'm a 15-year-old football player who is 5'9" and weighs 126 pounds. I'm looking to put on a lot of weight for the season. Currently, I'm eating lots of protein and drinking protein shakes daily, along with eating lots of protein bars. I was wondering what your opinion is on creatine and how I can bulk up safely. Thanks.
So I think Noah's asking a really important question, that some kids are feeling these pressures to gain weight for athletics while others feel pressure to lose weight. And both of these can be stressful. So I'd be interested to get your opinions, your advice that you have for these teens that are managing these pressures in a healthy way.
You're absolutely right. It's definitely a difficult pressure in both directions. We talk much too much about weight and body size as a society, and the kids obviously feel it, and they feel pressured to change their body shape in one direction or another. I really encourage my patients not to focus on getting to any particular size, but to really getting to a point of health and functionality that they want to be at. And I know that can feel hard for a football player who knows that there's a physical advantage to being bigger, but I would try really hard to focus less on a pounds goal and more on a functional goal. Something like, I want to be able to bench this many pounds so that my strength is where I want it to be on the field, because that's something you can control and that's something that you can work on. In terms of healthy ways to build that muscle, this is true for really anyone who's going on an exercise journey and trying to build muscle, whether they're trying to lose weight at the same time or gain weight at the same time. What Noah described as his focus on protein is absolutely what I recommend. We don't recommend the creatine supplements in kids so far. They do seem like they're helpful for building muscle in adults, but they haven't been studied enough in kids or teenagers to know if they're safe yet. So I don't recommend trying that yet for a teenager. What I recommend is that real focus on protein. And so you want to make sure that every meal you're having has a protein in it. That might be making sure that dinner is chicken with some vegetables, or that might be making sure that your snack is instead of something like crackers, maybe apples and peanut butter, or making sure you're incorporating some cheese or some nuts into those snacks. Cheese, nuts, beans, fish, chicken are all really healthy, lean sources of protein. And then just like Noah mentioned as well, we do those protein shakes and protein bars can be very useful for kids who are trying to work in some extra protein, especially if they have certain sweet cravings for other foods. You just want to be, anytime you're using those, you want to be really careful about looking at the nutrition label to make sure you understand what's in it. Because some of the brands will sneak in a lot of sugar with that protein, and that's not nearly as helpful. So you want to start looking at those nutrition labels and making sure that you're choosing brands that are high on the protein but low on the sugar.
You know, in my house, we have a rule: athletes eat. And so, yes. You just don't worry about it. It's if you're doing the work, you probably need the fuel.
Well, and I would emphasize in context of our earlier discussions about obesity, everybody eats and food is not the enemy. So as long as we're making healthy choices with what we're eating, we're getting in lots of protein, fruits, and vegetables. We don't need to feel bad about the idea of eating at all.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you.
Yeah.
Before you go to the listeners, we'll be sure to put into the show notes where you might be able to follow the work of Dr. Nadeau and Dr. Cartwright. We also want to remind our listeners to check out Dr. Cartwright's article, which we spotlighted today and can be found in this month's issue of Diabetes. It's titled Adipose Tissue as a Target for Precision Medicine Approaches in Childhood Obesity. You should also find this information or the link to the article in the episode notes. As always, don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe for more diabetes bio content.
Thanks to all of you for joining us on the Diabetes Bio podcast. We hope that you're enjoying our discussion of the work that the Diabetes Journal is publishing each month. The feature articles we discuss in each episode are freely accessible at diabetesjournal.org/diabetes and are also listed in the episode notes for your reference. As with any podcast, it really helps us if you like, rate, follow, and subscribe to the podcast. And if you have any feedback for us, we'd love to hear that as well. We look forward to presenting to you each month.